finally, of course, Michelle's brilliant presentation that introduced me to a new game that I really will gain some mileage of in my classroom, and levels of listening. And so I want us to really think about using some of those levels of listening through what we are presenting this afternoon. So again, thanks for joining us to deepen our collective understandings and our intent to teach all students, particularly students in today's framework who identify as Black and Brown, with sincere deference to all of those Black and Brown men and women who have been murdered in this country in the year 2020 alone. So I, Denise Patman, dedicate this panel presentation to them. So first of all, we're gonna just really be very clear about operationalizing structural racism. And by that I mean the normalization and legitimization of various structures that exist that routinely privilege white people, and particularly white Anglo-Saxon Protestants in particular, from middle-class backgrounds. You know, I remember how a white female student in my undergraduate classroom had never heard of the Okies, and I'm using that in quotation marks. And it would just opened up a space for her to connect with what others may feel like from a socioeconomic perspective. So structural racism encompasses the entire system of white domination that includes history, culture, politics, economics, and permeates the entire fabric of our society. It contributes to the lower life expectancy of Black and Brown people, higher exposure to environmental toxins, dangerous jobs, and we are now recognizing from who were the first responders in many cities and towns across our nation, violence, lower rates of health care, anti-racist behavior in the classroom, therefore, aims to disrupt the structural racism, structural racist practices. And so for the purposes of today's focus, we hope that you commit yourselves to dismantling the structural racism in your spaces, to diffuse the trauma that all students experience as a result of living in a brutally racist society. I am Denise Patman, and I started my career in the Boston Public Schools. I joined the Boston Writing Project, National Writing Project Network in the early 1980s, and I have grown by leaps and bounds as a result of that affiliation. Google me if you'd like to know more about me or my achievements, but suffice it to say that my professional pride is enveloped in my work with the National Writing Project. I served on the National Writing Project Board of Directors for 10 years. I was a leader, as Laura mentioned, of the Project Outreach Network. I directed on a local space, the Calderwood Writing Initiative, of which both Bob and Mary are members or fellows. I'm currently working with the C3WP initiative that NWP provides. My NWP work that I again experienced today is my professional and personal nourishment. So I've worked with these colleagues, Bob and Mary, for many years, and they will introduce themselves, and then we'll get this party started. So Bob?
I am Bob. I am a teacher in Boston at another course college. Mary?
Hi, I'm Mary DeBinga, and I'm a teacher also in Boston at Boston Latin Academy, which is a middle and high school. And I teach English.
and they are powerhouses. As the slide states, if only we had more time. So please find your comfort space, a utility you would prefer to write with, and Bob will lead us through this exercise that he uses in his classroom.
So this is a short version of a tool I use with my own students where they have an option to do expressive writing. I'm going to ask everyone to take 3 minutes and please find a place to write, whatever is most comfortable for you on the computer or with paper and pen. And this is something we call writer's choice. Take 3 minutes and write about the thoughts and feelings you have about the moment, whatever is on your mind. 2, your place in society in terms of power, race, class, language, disability, sexuality, religion, or gender. 3, the positive, your strengths and or good things that you have in your life or have had and hope to have again. 4, the way you'd like to feel and think if you had complete control. So I'm going to start my timer. Please make a choice and write down your thoughts and feelings. We'll begin now. That has been 3 minutes. And I'm going to ask you for the moment to put aside the content of your writing and please share how it felt to do the writing. How do you feel now having written down your thoughts and feelings? Any volunteers?
In the chat room, thanks, Steph, for saying it felt like a relief. Clarence.
Yes. So That's the number one response I get from students is that they feel better after having done some expressive writing. So if a student comes in and they look agitated or they put their head down, my first response now is often to ask them to write something down if they choose. And sometimes they don't, but often they do. And many report feeling better, but not all of them. Did anyone have any other feeling other than relief?
Mm-hmm.
And in the chat, we have a couple of expressions of it being uncomfortable or unsettling. And a lot of those are sort of tempered afterwards by saying they still felt like they wanted more of it or felt like continuing it, but not everyone.
Sure. And some research suggests that, and every time I've done this exercise with teachers, some folks report feeling a little worse after. And there's research that suggests near and medium term affect can be lower for some people when they do expressive writing. It can bring up unsettling thoughts and things that are hard to face.
Mm-hmm.
But the research also suggests long-term affect generally improves with the use of expressive writing.
And
So,
Richard spoke a little bit about that this afternoon as well.
yeah. And Mary here will explain some of the choices that we gave you.
Mary will also remember to unmute herself. One thing that we showed you before, so you're looking at a slide that is the same slide we showed you before with a couple of additions. So what I want to point you towards first, sorry, it is not visually appealing, but it has the information that we need. You'll notice that there are some things that are highlighted in green that were not there before, and those we wanted to add and show you, but we didn't want to overwhelm you. And there is research that says that 3 to 4 choices in writing is helpful, and more than that can be overwhelming. But these are some options that we wanted to present to you and for you to see, even if we didn't have you do them this time. But one thing that I wanted to point to first is that the first one we gave you was wide open. And in giving wide open choice to people, and particularly to our students, it is letting them write about anything, but I want to point to a couple of things that usually come up from the students who are choosing to write about anything. And one of the things that students are doing when they're writing about anything is that gives them the moment to respond to things that are heavy needs. There's sort of I think sort of 3 ways that this goes. One is heavy, one is light, and one is refusal, right? And on the heavy end of it, if something that is really traumatic for the student just happened that they're responding to, maybe in a class earlier that day, maybe in their family, whatever, that or in the world also, that is very present for them, they have the opportunity to be there in the moment with that thought. On the other end of it, though, not every student who's heavily impacted by something wants to be in that moment in the classroom. And sometimes if we give a response that insists that students deal with that thing at that moment when they are not prepared to do that, or they're not prepared in your space in your classroom at that moment, or 5 minutes before they go take a geometry test, you know, it isn't when they want to unpack all of that. It's good to give them the option where they can either go to a topic that's very light, or even write their annoyance at the fact that you have told them that they have to do this. So it's very important to give the open choice, but to also understand that that has what that can contain. There is giving explicit opportunities to write about race and power, and to explicitly understand that there's a connection there of not just like what your racial experience is, but how that connects to power. It is also important, though, in terms of how we think about things, there's an over tendency, I think, in classrooms that when we have students write about traumatic things, to just sort of stay in the trauma and to sort of invite all of the negative. And I think it's really important to bring in strengths-based research of giving students the option, and even if they don't take it, that they've read the words to think about, that you can write about the positives and the strengths and the things that help you through or carry you through, or those things that you have inside of you or around you that bring out those strengths. And then building on that is this idea of possible selves, and looking at students can write about both the positives of who they could be or how this could be different. And Michelle, you did such a beautiful job of showing us this in your presentation, of thinking about the possible selves and the different ways that you could act in a situation and bring that out for students as well. And Bob has said before, this is this can go in both a positive direction, or they could write the who they'll never be, which is an interesting direction. And so yeah, you can go to the next slide, Bob. Oh, no, I didn't talk about the ones we didn't. Sorry, the new ones.
No,
You're right. No, go back. Sorry, I forgot. Thank you very much. The other part that's included in green, so if you look at the things that we didn't include this time but are also hugely important, it's really important to give students opportunities to write about school. And to write about the feelings and experiences that they are having, not just out there in the world, but to remember that the school is also a place where they are having experiences and reactions and identity. And to also be able to talk about, you know, it can sometimes be covered in the open, but also it's okay to say, you know, is there anything that's troubling you at this moment right now? And to name conflict or stress, and then to talk about, as a teacher, if you're doing this type of writing, to also engage in writing where we are thinking of particular students and how either we have responded in the past, to do that reflection, or to think about how we would or will respond, right? Looking forward again in that possible self-work as teachers. And just thinking again of how important choice is here. To think about the fact that students make different choices in different spaces, and that is both a space of time, like today I want to do this, tomorrow I don't. And also think about it in terms of the spaces. Yours may not be the classroom or the particular peer group that they're around, or for whatever reason, may not be the space that they want to engage in this prompt today. But leave things open so that they have a variety of choices. And also thinking about, I think the topic we don't talk about enough is sort of teacher self-efficacy and what we feel like we can responsibly create safe space for in our classroom. Can we responsibly have sharing go in particular ways and not other ways, and thinking about our role in things, and not wanting to do violence to our students in the ways that we force them into experiences that they're not ready for. And that's what choice gives us a way around. Richard's presentation of it earlier in saying that some people will share, but not everybody, takes the pressure off of, okay, I know that I have the opportunity, but I'm not going to be compelled to if it's something that I'm not ready for, and gives me the space to be able to do my writing on my own. And now if we can go to the next. So I'm going to share two slides which are just writing from my classroom with my students. And the first one I want to share, I've been using since March Jamboard in my class to do write into the days with my students, so they can post notes that are anonymous that no one sees, but are very quick writes that we're doing on a topic. And I was using this very much to, this student work as immediate feedback to me to sort of see where my students were. And this one, the prompt is right there, sort of buried by some of the stickies that are there, but what I wish the world could learn is, and this was my prompt pretty recently, right after the murder of George Floyd. And what I didn't do to my students is say, what do you think about racism? What do you think about this murder? What do you think about, I asked them something about where they were in the world. And I also have a curriculum that I was working on with them where this is naturally where we were going and writing about ourselves anyway. And the students who had that present for them and that's what they wanted to write about is exactly where they went with it. And other students went other directions with it, and it allowed that space for where they are. If you can go to the next one. What I also did with my students, this is a different day. This is a prompt which started with the prompt, it's complicated, and it's something I started in actually my 12th grade AP literature class. Because what I was realizing is that my students were having a very hard time with prompts that are particularly complex for students to answer, where they had to talk about a complicated relationship between characters in a novel. And that's because they have to write about multiple facets of things, was very hard for students. And I realized that it isn't that hard though when we think about it, because all our own relationships are complicated, right? And so what I did was having the students start from their own experience, where we actually have a deep innate understanding of complexity in our own context, right? And we're able to transfer that then to understanding how to write about this complexity when we're doing a more traditional essay prompt. And again, here I give choice. So they could talk about, well, not everybody wants to talk about their complicated family dynamics. They could also talk about their pet. They could talk about school, and they could talk about the experience of being at home during the pandemic and a lockdown, which Boston had. And I'm going to pass it over to Bob to talk more about sort of how we have that choice in prompts.
Sure. So the more I gave students choice in writing in a journal expressively and in other ways over the years, it really made me think about choice in the curriculum that I had been assigning to them for 15 years. And so I began to ask them more questions through Google Classroom, Google Forms. Do you guys want to read this racist text, Heart of Darkness? And here's why we might read it. Here's why we might not. And we voted. And overwhelmingly, they wanted to look at a book of seminal racism in world literature that for many decades was taught as a classic. We then, I posted the question to them, should we spend 3 days on a debate or go right into Things Fall Apart, which is a direct response to Conrad? They voted for debate, and in years past, I would have assigned the debate topics, but this time I asked them, you guys propose debate topics to your peers, and then whichever one gets the most votes, that's the debate we'll have. So we had 3 different debates in 3 different periods. Here's what the kids came up with instead of me. Does the colonizer colonize based on racism, or is racism a byproduct of colonization? In period 3, is the text racism more damaging than revealing, or more revealing than damaging? Period 4, does colonization completely warp the personality or expose our true intentions? 3 really profound questions that came from kids. And it felt like those choices made all the difference as I grew them in the curriculum. Denise will hear you.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks, Bob, for showing us the power of expressive writing and its connections to self-identity, self-exploration, and discovery. Note that there are times when we'll talk about expressive and reflective writing. We're using them interchangeably for the purposes of today. So as you know, Jimmy Britton is sometimes known as the father of expressive writing, and Nancy Martin would therefore be the mother of expressive writing. They remind us that expressive writing is thinking aloud on paper. And this thinking aloud on paper is the closest to the self. And we need to identify that closeness of the self before we can then provide any sort of commitment to paper for transactional and or poetic discourse. And if you've not read Moffat and or Britton's book, The Development of Writing Abilities from the University of London, it's a must read. It's old, it came out in the 1970s, but it's really important as a framework for looking at expressive writing and the use of expressive writing. So very powerful sharing results from expressive writing, as we've uncovered, but there are also dangers and warning areas. And what you see on this PowerPoint is what I've identified as blocks and what are facilitations for building authentic relationships in the classroom in an anti-racist context. So let's start with the blocks. This is not from a teacher's point of view. You have to remember this is not a therapeutic session for you or that you were building with your students, but rather you may be the conduit to therapeutic services that the school or the city has to offer. Mary is the first person that I knew who introduced me to the notion of trauma porn, which is oftentimes when Black and Brown children's trauma is exploited. There are moments of adversity that students share with us, then gets generated into a sort of victim role, and that's a real huge block. So please beware of that. The third bullet is that we're not asking as for you as allies to be an emotional support for student. Please, for your own emotional support, this is really keep it student-centered. And finally, and it's happened to me in many, many experiences, but I have to recognize that what students are writing and sharing with me are not sources for my education. So that oftentimes I have to go outside of the classroom and read more, question some of my colleagues if there is something that I don't understand. That certainly was true for me with the Armenian Holocaust, um, that has the largest population here in Watertown, Massachusetts, that I knew very, very little about, that surfaced through writing in one of my undergraduate classes. But I did not want to victimize or stigmatize the student who was sharing some of those thoughts. Now, next, what facilitates our authentic inquiry. We've talked about inquiry stance all day today, caring questions, maintaining the dignity of students and their families. Sometimes I've had to think about what I would want and not want my own child to discuss discuss in terms of his racial identity development with folks in school. To feel okay to make mistakes, but to recognize those, to write about those, and maybe to share that with a thinking partner who might be in your school. This is not trauma porn light. It's okay to make those mistakes. We all do. And finally, oftentimes we are the caring adult, or can be a caring adult in the student's life who is dealing with a lot. So oftentimes it's enough to just acknowledge what the student is sharing with you. And I think those 4 levels of listening, again, that Michelle shared with us, is very helpful here. So Mary will read aloud. We'd like to share the student voice in a much more detailed fashion. She will read aloud the sample of student writing that demonstrates the risks that a student took in writing about life.
So this was in response to, you can see the prompt at the top is express yourself through a journal entry, poetry, lyrics, hip hop, and free writing. So notice this is an open prompt. Right now, there's a lot of things on my mind. I've been really stressed out with just about everything. As we get closer and closer to the end of the school year, more and more deadlines are coming up, especially with money. I recently found out that my mom's annual income is about $11,000. But that's only if my dad pays child support every week, which he usually doesn't. So the income is far less. My mom has been really stressed out about my senior year because it feels like every week they're asking for money for yearbook or prom or whatever, and we can't afford that. I get paid $60 a week, but I usually use that money to get a few groceries for my mom and I. I feel like the financial situation for my mom and I is getting worse and worse each day as each day goes by. My dad still owes around $500 in child support. My mom has been waiting for my father's taxes to come in, but something tells me he didn't file them this year. I've been so stressed out that I can barely sleep, to the point where, as soon as I woke up this morning, my eyes were burning. It hurt to open my eyes because I'm so tired. But I still push myself to go to school every day for the sake of my mom, who worries a lot about me when I don't go to school. I'm doing my best to keep my mom from stressing out and worrying about me a lot more than she needs to. I just really hope my father finally pays off all the child support he owes, because we really need it. It would help us so much with everything we're struggling so much to. So much to, and it cuts off there.
So in the chat, if you reflect for a moment, if you could write, how would you respond? What thoughts are going through your head imagine the students in your class as she was in mine. What do you say to the student, and what do you do? And because we're short on time, we'll if somebody, Mary, if you see something in the chat that you want to read out, that'd be great. But I'll tell you some teachers' responses I've had in the past. One young teacher said, I think I'd get her some groceries. And I think when you read heavy stuff from students, it definitely can bring up thoughts of, in my own mind, little moments of temptation to be the white savior. And when we talked about this, Mary, you recall you said, this student isn't looking for that. That she doesn't need you to get her groceries. She needs you to be her English teacher. And so I think working through the temptation to sort of fix things for kids in a way that works on the surface or works deeper. I've known colleagues who've taken students into their homes. But what I think is important here is for this student to see that I see her. And what I did is I asked this young woman for a moment in private, and I explained to her I had no idea that you were going through this, and you have such strength and grace, and are working so hard in class, and I'm in such deep admiration for you. And I think she felt better hearing that. She felt better writing this down. I also connected with the guidance counselor to make sure that she knew that this student was food insecure, it seems. And the guidance counselor can help her with those kinds of issues. What I think she needed from me is that I saw her strengths and I admire her resilience.
And what we see in the chat is reflecting a lot of that, of thanking the student for sharing and trusting. And the point again that sometimes folks are not asking for help. What they're asking for in that moment is to be seen and heard. And being able to be clear with students and give space to give that clarity around what it is that they are looking for. And understanding role and finding. And of course the resources aren't always there, but being able to connect students to resources that are, but really, really being sensitive to what is it they were trying to get in that moment from that writing.
And so for this student and for so many others, in my experience, and the research bears it out, Penn-Baker and Chung argue for the benefits of expressive writing as a way to reduce cognitive load by venting stress and to facilitate personal change, because it gives us a chance to step back and look at life's big picture to help us make course corrections. And it's often now my go-to sort of de-escalation thing. If I see a student agitated or distressed, I give them the journal and I ask them to write. And you can almost see, not in every case, but often, the sort of stress melt a bit and the cognitive load reduce. This is Denise.
So Kendi has arrived in Boston. He will direct BU's brand new Center for Anti-Racist Research. He starts in July, but he's also has already given so much to our current environment here. He's had Zoom conversations, which I missed last week, and his work is cut out for him as he attempts to bring together researchers and practitioners from across BU and within the New England Northeast region to engage around issues of racism and racial justice. Now, his two most popular books are Stamped, and I have Stamped right here, Racism, Anti-Racism, and How to Be an Anti-Racist. The latter, which is what you see on the screen, Bob has read. I haven't gotten to it yet. And Bob says that Kendi helps folks see that anti-racist educators must move beyond mindsets and moral sentiments to action, 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 changing policies and renegotiating power in classrooms and schools. Stamped, the book I'm most familiar with, is about the social construction of race, the history of race, looking at the beginning with the world's first racist. And I would say that his voice, along with Jason Reynolds, has voice and is compelling. So also, you should read Bettina Love's book if you've not read it. I think we've referenced it a lot throughout the day. As she argues that educators must teach students about racial violence, oppression, and giving back to the communities to make us far more sustainable and enduring. Dr. Love is all about empowerment and civic engagement and intersectional justice. And I would recommend all three of these texts for the summer.
And Denise, I wanted to jump in again, just going back to the chat and something that Richard put in there, which I think is really important. We have the problem today of having such an incredibly skilled group of educators in this meeting together today that you are way ahead of some of the basic things that we're saying here, but with the point of that it's not wrong in all cases to also meet the immediate physical need that the student has, right? Like sometimes students do actually need groceries that you can get them in that moment, but the idea being, and if we're looking back at where that was, the focus of it, and even in Richard's reply in the chat here, the focus is first acknowledging and empowering that student in that moment, right? That we don't want students who have been victimized in so many ways to only see themselves as problems to be solved and things that are addressed outside of them. And that what we empower them to do through recognizing their writing is an agency that we're giving back to them, and even an empowerment. And Richard, I love the way you put it, in telling this, not telling the student first, oh, you need food, but telling the student first, you said that so beautifully, and you have such a powerful piece that people need to hear. Yes. And the difference in those two things, even if in both cases you end up giving that student food, is the difference in that student seeing themselves as someone who has agency and power and a story to tell versus someone who is just society's problem to be solved.
Thank you. I hadn't looked at it. Bob?
3 minutes left. Mary, you're up.
Your response to student voices?
Yeah.
I think,
sorry, I got myself up checking with that. What, again, this goes back to sort of exactly what I was saying, is this idea of thinking about how our responses in the moment and looking at student work and how we respond to it needs to do healing and not more harm, right? That in order to do this, we need the level of self-reflection, because we are not a blank slate reading this, right? And we understand the power dynamics within a classroom are there, and that how we do this involves our own self-reflection, involves thinking about what is our dialogue to the student and what is that saying to the student about themselves. And then understanding that we also have the need for teacher-to-teacher dialogue. We are not going to do this perfectly, and the people that we need, our students absolutely are our teachers. Our students absolutely are showing us things within the classroom, but if we rely on them to do the work for us, that's a problem, and we need to be seeking our own peer support and our own learning outside of that as well. And then with this, again, of going back always to this idea of how we're not only shifting policies and practice, but also how we're shifting power, and looking at the student as a whole person, looking at what the writing can do and what expressive writing can do for our students.
And looking at their families as whole families, whomever the caregiver may be. I'm sorry, we're running out of time. So.
Absolutely, please.
I wonder if we could ask people just in the chat to read. We're almost out of time, and write write something in the chat if they see something that they'd like to respond to. These are student responses gathered in an anonymous survey in 2014 on what it felt like to do the expressive writing.
Yeah, Carla, that's right.
We've got 30 seconds, and I did want to say briefly, there need to be tiers of responses to student writing, from a quick note to a brief conference. Not everything needs a conference. Sometimes a kid will need a counselor, or if the student is in more immediate danger, communication with the dean. But also, as an educator, the tiers of responses are to build caring, supportive relationships, increase accommodations and flexibility according to student needs, create culturally sustainable pedagogy, and the deeper change, I think, includes adapting pedagogy and curriculum to shift power and policy. So we have cautions. We'll put this slide deck up if people want to look more at the cautions we've had. If you'd like to share your own cautions, we have an online journal that I'll put the link into the chat. So we're doing this work during COVID, so students can do this writing remotely. We have an exit ticket. Mary, I don't know if you can put that in the chat.
And Bob and I are working on a project to come up with a text of a sort with samples of student work, exercises for educators, with a anti-racist platform that will be informed by teachers in the greater Boston area.
Yep. So lucky to work with Denise and Mary, and they've helped me so much. With that, I'm going to stop sharing. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time and attention.
And please complete the exit ticket so that we can get feedback from you. It's 3 quantitative and 2 short, little open-ended questions. We know we're the only ones that did that today. So sorry, but
we're the only smart ones that did that today. We'll learn from you next time.
Thank you.
Oh my goodness, Mary, Robert, and Denise, you just like really finished us out strong today. Thank you so